Welcome to today's session. This is part of our Black History Month presentations. And today we are having a presentation called Frederick Douglass and the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Today's session is part of Geneseo's month-long celebration honoring Black History Month. And this is part of our efforts of becoming an anti-racist college. This series of events and sessions is planned and organized by the Anti-Racism and DEI Subcommittee of the President's Commission on Diversity and Community. And we're hoping that these presentations will spark discussions, reflections, and actions as we work in our ongoing vision towards anti-racism. I am going to include the entire series here in the chat for those of you that would like to find out more information. It is my great pleasure today to welcome Kenneth B. Morris, co-founder and president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Before we begin, I'd like to ask everyone to mute your microphones during this presentation. We do, however, encourage you to use the chat feature to provide questions for Mr. Morris. We have allotted about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a Q&A. We just ask that all questions and comments are grounded in respect. We please ask that there be no disrespect towards the presenter, the moderator, or any of the participants allowed. We reserve the right to remove participants if these expectations are violated. Ken Morris is the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. He is reviving the critical work of his ancestors here in Rochester in a key leadership role at the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Morris continues a family legacy in anti-slavery, education, and anti-racism while helping to craft and implement innovative programming to address these persistent issues still facing communities today. And with that, it is my great pleasure to welcome Ken Morris.
Hi, Dave. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. I appreciate the invitation to join you and to have an opportunity to talk about the work that we're doing at Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, as well as the legacies of my great ancestors, Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass. It's been a busy week for me. We are working on a project about Douglass's connection to Ireland. And there's a week-long celebration called Douglass Week in Ireland. So I've had about 5 or 6 panels that I've been doing this week, and I'm glad we were able to work out a time for me to be able to join you. It's my great honor to be with you. As you introduced me, I am the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass, and I'm also the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And every time I tell people what my relationship is to my ancestors, not only is it a mouthful trying to say all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel like I'm far removed. And you might be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know a grandparent, and some of you may even know a great-grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglas, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. Now, she didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglas's lap, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him, the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when we started our work, our first tour that we did in schools was in 2008. It was called the Douglass Dialogues Tour. And I remember being with a group of middle school students, and they were all looking at me kind of cross-eyed, like, man, you were so far removed, and what does all of this history have to do with our lives today? And why are you talking about these people that lived so long ago? So I was trying to give them some context to help them wrap their minds around the distance between the generations and how close we actually are. And I had this profound thought that hands that touched the great Frederick Douglass and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine. So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand one person away from each man, I stand one person away from history, and I stand one person away from slavery. We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country when you consider the generations. So I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about two men that were born into slavery. They were both born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education, they were able to rise up and to affect change in their lives and affect change for all of us. Now, we know from our US history, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, so my ancestors would have to steal their education. Now, when Frederick Douglass became this great white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for vice president of the United States, first African-American US Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor right there in Rochester, New York. And people would see him with all of these accolades and they would say, Frederick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom and being a self-taught scholar, he would respond on occasion by saying, my degree is written on my back. My degree is written on my back. So both of my ancestors understood the importance of education, and these messages are still as relevant today. So I'm going to be talking to you a lot about history, but as I do, don't just think about history as some fixed point in the past, but history is about the present and it's about the future. And the better that you know where you come from, the more you're going to know where you're headed. And the better that you know where you come from, you can navigate your way in the world today better. So as I'm talking, think about these points in history and how they are relevant to today, the challenges that we face today. And we're going to talk about some ideas that you all can do to work on injustice in your own communities and to work together with a vision that Frederick Douglass had of a racial equitable society. Now, Frederick Douglass was born with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born into slavery to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his enslaver was his father. Never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and spend just a few precious moments with him until he would fall asleep, and then she would have to walk 12 miles back so that she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, or she was likely going to face punishment. Now, he did have someone early on in his life that showed him some love and nurturing and care, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. Now, her job on the plantation was to raise the children until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6 years old. Excuse me. When Frederick was around that age, she came to him and said, we're going to go on a long journey. And that journey was a 12-mile walk to the main plantation, to the big house. Now, if you can imagine, that walk took a long time, and Frederick is clinging to his grandmother's skirt. He's scared. She's carrying him much of the way when his legs wouldn't carry himself. And then they would finally make that long walk from the road up the driveway. And Frederick sees this house that's bigger than anything he had ever seen in his life. And he wanders off to check out his surroundings and to look for something to eat. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone. Now you had this boy who was truly an orphan. As I mentioned, he had only seen his mother a handful of times. He didn't know who his father was. He had 5 brothers and sisters that he'd been separated from that were like strangers to him. So you had this boy who had no family, he had no home, and he had no country because he was not considered a citizen of the United States as an enslaved person. But yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of those circumstances of enslavement and oppression, he was able to rise up, and as I said earlier, to affect change. And the way that he was able to do that was because of education. Now, I'm going to tell you a story that was really important in his life. In fact, he described this incident in his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, published in 1845. He wrote in that book that I was always so hungry as a slave child. And I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush and throw it into a pig's trough. And all of the children would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could, including Frederick, to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He did not own himself. He was no better than the cattle, the sheep, the horses. So what happened around this time of 8 or 9 years old, he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's family. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that he could learn to read and write from, but he was now going to be in the big city. He would be around free Black children and he would be around poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. She didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. She was already teaching her young son, Tommy, and there was Frederick alongside, wide-eyed and eager to learn. So she just naturally, out of the kindness of her heart, started to teach him his ABCs. And that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental darkness, into his mental bondage. And those lessons continued for a while until his enslaver, his master, found out about him, Hugh Auld. And when Hugh learned about these lessons, he got angry and he forbade them. And he looked at his wife and he looked at young Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Now, I hope you all heard that message. You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave. Frederick heard that message loud and clear, and he looked at his master and he said, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, and education equals freedom. Education equals liberation. Education equals emancipation. And he would teach himself to read and write. Now, he was very clever in the way that he went about doing this. He was now, as I said, interacting with the children in the neighborhood, and he would trick them. You know, he would pick up a stick and scratch into the ground and ask, "Is this how you write an S?" And they would say, "No, Fred, this is how you write an S." Now, do you remember that story that I just told you about how he had to eat out of a pig's trough on occasion? Well, one of the other ways that he would get his reading lessons is he would trade bread for those lessons. He would trade food, something of such great importance. And that says to me that Frederick would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty. And so now what his enslaver predicted would happen started to happen. He's self-educating himself, and he's starting to think critically now about his condition of enslavement. And he's asking questions like, why am I a slave? And why do you own me? And how do you know your birthday? Or why do you know your birthday? And I don't know my birthday. And then he would turn to God, and as he's praying to God for deliverance from his chains and his bondage, he would ask God, you know, my master goes to church on Sunday, puts on a suit and goes to church. And in the word and the Bible and cherry-picked scriptures, finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property. Frederick is starting to now make the distinction between what he would later call the slave-holding Christianity of the land, using the word of God to justify mistreating people, taking away their humanity and their freedom. He's making this distinction that slave-holding Christianity versus what he would call the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. So now I don't have time to go into his whole story, but I will fast forward and say that while he was enslaved in Baltimore as a teenage boy, he met my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglas. Now, Anna is a very important piece to this story. She's an important part of the story. Now, she was the first person in her family to be born free. And she and Frederick meet at some point. We don't know exactly where they met, but they do meet. And she, along with two Irishmen that were on the ship docks where Frederick worked as a ship caulker, planted the seed of thought in Frederick's mind for the first time that you're not meant to be a slave. You're not meant to be a slave for life. And as Frederick and Anna are starting to think about a life together, she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. Had Anna not sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape, had she not sewn the sailor's disguise that he would wear, who knows if Frederick Bailey would have had the courage to run away from slavery or the wherewithal. And had we not had his contributions as the great abolitionist, we may be sitting here as a very different country today. Now, Frederick would escape on September 3rd, 1838, at the age of 20 years old. He would escape by train and then by boat, and he would land in New York City and write a letter back to Anna to come join him. She came to join him. They got married and took on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson. And with the help of conductors on the Underground Railroad, the Underground Railroad is a network, it was a network of people, places, and spaces working together to help freedom seekers make it to freedom. So conductors suggested that this new couple go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick could likely get work on the ship docks. So that week, or that trip to New Bedford took about 2 weeks. They would land in New Bedford and then change their name to Frederick and Anna Douglas to make it harder for their enslaver to be able to track him down. Now, Frederick began to work on the ship docks, and a couple of years later, he attended an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island with a group of abolitionists. And when they heard that this fugitive slave was in the audience, they asked Frederick, will you just stand up? Will you tell the audience your story? Tell them what it was like to be a slave. And Frederick writes again in that narrative, he said, I was so nervous that first time speaking in front of a white audience that I was shaking from every limb. But when he stood up, he had this natural gift for communication. He was charismatic, he was eloquent, he was theatrical, and he was even funny in some of the descriptions of the characters that he came into contact with while enslaved. And the speech was a hit. The abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison, who was a white abolitionist, knew that they had a star on their hands. And so they asked Frederick if he would join the anti-slavery speaking circuit as a paid lecturer. And so he did, and he would go from town to town, city to city, just telling his story. Well, then he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he had ever been enslaved. Now, they couldn't wrap their minds around what they were seeing in Frederick Douglass and what they thought they knew about an enslaved person. Now, you have to remember that those that were pro-slavery and the federal government made a group of people an other to justify mistreating them, taking away their freedom. They would say things like, well, these people are savages from Africa. They're better off in slavery. Well, at least they're getting the Christian religion. They're getting taken care of. They're getting fed. I mean, listen to the happy songs that they sing. They're making a group of people an other to justify mistreating them. Now, remember when I said history is not just about the past, but it's also about the present. And perhaps maybe when we get to the Q&A, we can discuss this a little bit more, but think about ways in which this othering manifests itself today. You know, I've heard in the news about people coming in caravans from Latin America and Mexico that they are coming to invade our country. They're coming to infest our country. They're rapists, they're criminals, some of them. Here we are again, making a group of people and others so that when they do come to our country, we can separate families and put children in cages. So history is not just about the past, but it's also about the present. And so Frederick Douglass is out there and he's speaking about what he had experienced in slavery. And it's really starting to change the course of the abolitionist movement, because his importance at that time was he was really one of the first people who had been enslaved who had the talent and the gift for communication to be able to tell the audience what slavery really was, not this watered down version that you're hearing to justify it, but what it really was. Well, people started to doubt it. And in order to prove that he wasn't a fraud as they claimed him to be, he wrote that first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was published in 1845. It became a bestseller, selling 5,000 copies. Well, now he had another problem. That's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver. It made him a household name. It made him a celebrity. So it was suggested that he flee to Europe for a couple of years as a cooling off period. And he would go to Ireland and England and Scotland and raise money and get supporters for his cause of the abolition of slavery in the United States. He would eventually land in this place called Newcastle upon Tyne in England. And with the help of his abolitionist friends who did a fundraiser to raise money to purchase his freedom from his enslaver for $711, he was able to return back to the United States a free man. He and Anna and the children would move to Rochester, New York, where he would publish the North Star newspaper, which became the leading abolitionist voice. The Douglass family spent 25 years in Rochester doing really, I think, Frederick's most important work around the abolition of slavery. Now, Booker T. Washington benefited from the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he and his family were freed, and he was about 9 years old in Virginia. Now, he wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines of West Virginia at night so that he could begin his reading lessons and his writing lessons during the day. And so he continued to work every night and faithfully took his lessons during the day. And then one night when he was in the mines, he heard these older gentlemen, two older gentlemen, talking about this place called Hampton Institute in Virginia. And they were talking about Hampton as a place where formerly enslaved people could go and get an industrial education, learn how to do something, learn a trade. Now, Frederick had no concept of what any type of higher education meant, but what he was hearing from these men, he thought heaven, that Hampton literally must be heaven. And when he would eventually raise enough money, and with the help of community members, he would make a 500-mile walk at the age of 16 to go to school at Hampton. Now, that walk took a long time. He ran out of money on several occasions. He had to take odd jobs along the way. He slept outside. He slept under bridges. And the message about education in this story is that there was no challenge too great for him to overcome, no obstacle insurmountable. And when he would finally get to Hampton after that long journey, he went straight to the headmistress of the school and said, I want to enroll. I want to go to school here. And she looked at him, and his clothes were disheveled and torn, and he was dirty. And she said, young man, you're not worthy of admittance into this institution. Go on about your business. Well, he wasn't going to take no for an answer. So he came back the next day. She shooed him away. And he kept coming back, and he kept coming back. And she finally said, okay, Booker, you're driving me crazy here. I can see that you're not going to take no for an answer. So I'm going to give you an opportunity to prove yourself. There's a dirty classroom down the hallway. Go clean that. Let's see what you can do. Well, he had learned the value of hard work, working in those salt and coal mines every night. And now he was going to be able to put those skills to the test. And he cleaned and he cleaned. And when he was finished, she came in to do the white glove test, where she's looking for dirt on the tables and the chairs and the windowsills. Not only couldn't she find dirt, she couldn't find one speck of dust. That room was pristine. And so she looked at Booker and she said, okay, you've proven yourself. You're worthy for admittance into this institution. And not only that, we're going to give you a job as a janitor so you could work your way through school. He would start Hampton at 16 years old. He would graduate 4 years later. He would come back to Hampton as a teacher. And in 1881, he got word from this group down in a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, that they had some money to start a new school. And they wanted to use the model of Hampton as an industrial education. And word got back to this group that Booker T. Washington at Hampton was their man. And so Booker accepted the job. He rushed down to Tuskegee, and he was all excited to get started. And he's looking for an old church or an old schoolhouse where he could begin his lessons in a classroom type setting. But there was nothing but dirt and farmland as far as the eye can see. But he didn't get discouraged. That was not a challenge that was going to be too great for him to overcome. He started recruiting students. He started getting them excited about getting an education. And then one of the first things that he taught them to do was to make bricks. He taught them to make bricks so that they could build their own school. So at the age of 25, Tuskegee Normal School and Institute was founded. And if you do a Google search, you can see pictures of students building their own school in the hot sun. And this is how badly they wanted an education. Now Washington understood that education at Tuskegee needed to start with the basics. You couldn't start reaching for the higher aims in life until you could meet your basic needs in life. That was his philosophy. So education there started sometimes with hygiene, teaching them how to tie their shoes, brush their teeth. You've got all of these people that were formerly enslaved, and after 400 years of oppression and enslavement, when the last of those 4 million people were freed in 1865, there was no plan. Many of them spent just the first 3 years trying to reconnect with family. They didn't own property. They didn't have houses. They had nowhere to go. There was no counseling. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder designation. They were left to fend for their own, and Washington understood this. Washington also understood the climate of the country and that there were really two questions on the table. You may be an abolitionist and believe that slavery is morally wrong, but the second question of equality, you might not consider Black people equal to white people. And Washington understood that he was not going to be able to change the racist ideology in the South. So what he did instead was he showed Black people how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. So Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom. And it may be said that he is the person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. And so you had the father of the Civil Rights Movement in Frederick Douglass, and then the person that would take on the mantle of Black leadership in the country. And it just so happens that I'm related to them through my mother's side. My mother's mother was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter, and my mother's father was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. My grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee. They happened to be on campus the same day. They were rushing across to get to the other side and literally bumped into each other, not knowing that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married 3 months later. And when my mom, Nettie Washington Douglas, was born, she was the first person to unite the bloodlines of those historic families. And my mom was an only child. So I am the first male to carry that dual lineage. Now, I started to realize that I descended from some very important people when I was around 5 or 6 years old. I noticed that my ancestors were on statues. They were on money, postage stamps. Schools were named for them. Bridges and libraries were named for them. And everywhere I turned, I could start to feel that I was sitting and walking in this vast shadow of these two great American heroes. And I would, ask my classmates, are your grandparents on statues? And they would say, no. Your grandparents on money? No. Well, there was this weight of expectation that I started to feel on my shoulders. And to be honest with you, I didn't want any part of it. I spent most of my life running away from it. And everything changed in my life in 2005 when my co-founder and business partner, Robert Benz, who I believe is on this Zoom call, he handed me a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st Century Slaves, and it was an article about human trafficking and modern day slavery existing all over the country, all over the world, and existing right here in the United States, existing in Rochester, New York. And there was one night when I was reading another article, after I read that first article, it just shocked me. And I started to do a lot of research. And I remember sitting in my living room one evening and I'm reading a story about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service countless men almost every single day. And down the hallway, my two daughters were getting ready for bed. My older daughter was 12, my younger daughter was 9. So my older daughter, Jenna, was the same age as this young girl that I was reading about. And my daughters are laughing and playing and about to get tucked safely into bed. And my mind just starts racing and I'm thinking, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed, not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And when I walked in to say goodnight to them, I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And so Robert and I and my mom started putting our heads together and, how can we be effective in this anti-trafficking movement? And we settled upon education being the key to freedom. Remember the story that I told about Frederick Douglass when his enslaver said, education will unfit him to be a slave? Well, how can we connect with students and work so that the students become agents of change? They become modern day abolitionists, just like a Frederick Douglass. How can they unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive? And so we took the legacies of my ancestors. Frederick Douglass is a great abolitionist, Booker T. Washington as the great educator. Aha, abolition through education. So we immediately turned to schools. We eventually developed curricula called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. The power of one being service in the community, volunteerism in the community. Frederick Douglass said, it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And so if you think about the issue of human trafficking or racial oppression and injustice, or any issue that you as a student are passionate about eradicating, building strong children is the way that we're going to have short-term solutions, because we're able to give information to young people in K through 12 schools that's going to help protect them and reduce the vulnerability to them being trafficked for labor and for sex. But it's also a long-term solution, because these kids become the next generation of leaders. Now, you all as college students are, I'm sure, already leaders in your schools, your communities, your churches, your civic groups. But the idea is that we start to ask critical questions about what's happening today in the same way that Frederick Douglass asked, why am I a slave? You might ask yourselves, well, why am I born into a certain zip code and I have less opportunity or access to quality education, good health care, economic opportunity? Why is that versus somebody else born into another zip code through no fault of their own, who has a head start? They have access to all of these things. So no matter what zip code you come from, you need to be asking these questions and then putting yourself in the shoes of other people. And I hope, I'm going to close here in a few minutes, and when we get to the Q&A, we can discuss this a little bit further, but also asking questions about institutions and why is racism systemic throughout American life and exists, I believe, in every institution. How can we begin to dismantle these institutions? I mean, we've got a lot of problems today. The country is very divided as it's been since the Civil War. There's a lot of rhetoric out there that's hateful, it's sexist, it's racist, it's xenophobic, it's homophobic. We're a divided country right now. And unless we can start to reckon with our history and our past, I don't see that there's ever a way that we can get toward healing or reconciliation. So this means that we need to have conversations about the true history, not the whitewashed, sanitized version that we've been given to prop up white supremacy and to place people of color and people of Native American descent in an inferior position, but the real history about how this country was built off the backs of enslaved Africans. We have to have these conversations. And as young people, you really need to lead this effort with the vision of Frederick Douglass and what he had for the North Star, for his abolitionist newspaper. So think about it. We've got challenges ahead of us, but if we look back at our history and look back at the 19th century, imagine living at a time when your federal government said it's legal to own you and illegal to teach you. I think most people would have run away from that. And thank goodness Frederick Douglass and many others did not, or we would be a very different country sitting here today. History lives in all of us. Doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of. It lives in each and every one of you. We all descend from somebody that made a difference. We all descend from somebody that may have given up their lives just for the freedoms that we have in this country, may have given up their lives just so that some of us have a right to sit in a classroom and get an education. We stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. I remember I had a 10-year-old girl say to me one time during a class session, and she was so excited to share this with me. She said, Mr. Morris, I researched my family tree and I found that my great, four greats grandmother was born into slavery, taught herself to read and write in secret. And then she ran away and became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist. And she knew exactly what that word meant. And she was very proud of it. And so she said, so she's bouncing up and down in her chair. And so she said, Mr. Morris, do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins, just like you do. And I'll never forget that. We all have greatness flowing through our veins. Now, history lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that history forward. So I thank you all very much for this opportunity to share with you this afternoon. I look forward to the Q&A. I imagine that Dave, as the moderator, if there are questions, you can throw those questions out to me. If I see we've got almost 80 people on, so I don't know if we can open up microphones and just have an open discussion, but I'll leave that up to you. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Ken Morris. That was a very, very powerful talk. Gave me tons to think about, and I'm sure it did many of the people in our audience here. I would love very much to open it up for questions from anybody. You are free to turn on your cameras, turn on your microphones, or place questions in the chat, and I will be sure to relay those on to Ken Morris as well. While we're waiting for some questions to come in, oh, I see we have one in the chat right now from Griffin Nettie saying, upon which factor of Frederick Douglass's life do you hold in the highest regard?
You know, that's a really good question, and I don't think that I can really point to anything because he was a true Renaissance man. I mean, he did it all. I didn't have a chance really to talk about his use of photography and how he understood at the age of 22 that he could use this new technology that he would come of age with to make his arguments for liberation and equality in the same way that he would use his pen and his voice, because he understood that he was trying to counteract the narratives, the racist ideology that was out there and the caricatures that were out there that portrayed people of African descent as less than human. And he said, when you look at a photograph of me, you're never going to deny that I'm a man worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship, and you're never going to think that I'm a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And this is why you see him looking so directly into that camera with this fiery, fierce gaze saying, deny that I'm a man. Look at me in the eye and you will see my humanity. He was also a musician. He loved to play the violin. He taught my great-grandfather, Joseph, how to play the violin. And Joseph became a concert violinist playing all over the world and the first Black classical recording artist for the Victor Talking Machine Company. He was an abolitionist. He was a statesman. Remember when I started off, I talked about all of the governmental roles that he took on later in his life. He was a fighter for women's rights. I'm proud of him for a lot of things, but I think I'm most proud of his commitment, his lifelong commitment to women's rights and the fight for women's suffrage. He was at the 1848 Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, and he was the only man that was asked to speak during that convention. And he stood up and he argued in favor of inserting a women's suffrage resolution into the Declaration of Sentiments, which there was a fierce and contentious debate that was going on between the ladies. Some thought if we ask for something that's so improbable, the movement wouldn't be taken seriously. And there were others that thought, no, we need to put this in. We can't move slowly. We can't move incrementally. We have to put this in. So Frederick stood up. He argued in favor of inserting that resolution into the Declaration. And he was one of 32 men that signed it that day. So I'm very proud of him for his women's rights work and his lifelong commitment. So there's so much more, but I hope that my talk has inspired you to want to learn more about his life. He had 3 autobiographies, best-selling books that he wrote. He wrote tens of thousands of articles and essays, and he was the most photographed American of the 19th century, photographed more than President Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, and the only people in the world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family.
We'll be sure to send out links to those resources and autobiographies as well. I know our colleagues in the library have done a great job at collating that information. One question I have, I actually serve as the co-chair of the Becoming an Anti-Racist College project with Crystal Simmons from the School of Education. Crystal Simmons and I have been doing some work with a number of colleagues here on campus, trying to identify some of the racist policies here at the college that we can change. And I'm wondering if you have any insight from your work, looking at institutions of education, what are some of the most common racist policies that you are seeing throughout the education system?
And I visited many of Black women, to tenure. I think that in Rochester, I'm sure it's the same as in many other places around the country, that there are discriminatory policies that prevent people of color, but in particular women, to advance within the university structure. So that's one area. I'm sure that if we were to sit down and really look at the various policies, we could identify more, but that's the first thing that jumps out at me.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Not to cut in, but I had a quick question.
Please do.
And Kenneth, this is a personal question. I was wondering if you didn't have young children, if you would have been as impacted by the article on human trafficking, and whether you think you would have gotten into that kind of work.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've never been asked that before, so I haven't really thought about it. I would like to say that I would have still been impacted by that article, but I don't know. Having 2 young daughters, and when I talk to other men about issues of human trafficking and the rights for women and girls, that we shouldn't, as men, have to have 2 daughters or have daughters to be impacted and to be concerned about these issues, that it doesn't matter. I could have 5 sons and I still should be just as concerned. So I would like to think that I still would have been impacted in the way that I was, but I can't say for sure. It's a good question. I'm going to ruminate on that and think about it a little bit more after we hang up here.
Well said, and I'm actually also the father of 2 daughters, and it's one of those things that you just don't know. You would like to think that you would do the right thing, but you just don't know. Glenn Geyser Getz has a question. How do you find hope in our country in this challenging time? And what keeps you going with this work?
I find hope in my ancestors and all of the freedom fighters that came before us. I remember in December of 2017, I had an opportunity to sit down with the late Congressman John Lewis in his office in Washington, D.C. And I had met him several times in passing, but this was the first time I really had an opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with him. And we were sitting around the table. And at that time, he had been boycotting some events that Trump had inserted himself into, in particular, the opening of a new civil rights museum in Mississippi, where Congressman Lewis was supposed to give the keynote, and he decided to boycott that. And so this was shortly after, he was getting a lot of hits in the press from the right wing of the Republican Party, the far right wing. And I sat down next to him, and when I started to talk, I had tears welling up in my eyes, because what I wanted to say to him was, thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done for our country, for your sacrifice, for your courage, for your steadfastness. And, he put his hand on my shoulder, and tears were in his eyes. And he said, no, it is you I need to thank, because of your ancestors and the inspiration and the hope that they gave us during the civil rights movement. We quoted, he said, Frederick Douglass throughout the civil rights movement. And so I asked him, I said, are you hopeful for the future? Are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic about the future? And again, he still had tears in his eyes. And he said, no, I am hopeful that we will come out on the other end a better country. We'll be more respectful of each other. We'll come to the table listening and have empathy and treat each other with dignity and respect. And he said, I believe that we can get there. And I said, thank you for that, because that's how I feel. I am hopeful. Frederick Douglass had a great quote. He said, without struggle, there is no progress. And so we are certainly going through a mighty struggle right now. But that's why it's incumbent upon all of us and the young people that are listening to this conversation to work together, to work collaboratively in your community, and to cross zip codes and really continue this fight. Because what are our great-great-great-grandchildren going to say about us 150 years from now? Will they look at you and will they say, I'm really proud of my ancestor, my great-great-great-grandmother, because she was on the right side of history? I know plenty of descendants of people that were on the wrong side of history, and they're not so proud of their ancestors, and they won't even talk about their connection. And I wish these people today that are in Congress, and I'm not going to identify any parties because we're an apolitical organization, and I can't talk about politics, but I wish those people would not think about just about their careers as politicians, but to think about the country and what's best for the country and how their descendants will view them. Will they be on the right side of history, or will they be on the wrong side of history? Because I can tell you, being a descendant of two people that were on the right side of history, I am very proud of that. And their work continues today because of the Frederick Douglass family initiatives. There would be no Frederick Douglass family initiatives if my ancestors would have been on the wrong side of history.
Well said, well said. We have a few questions in the chat, but I want to make sure that I get this one in before we run out of time. You've talked about the young people getting involved, being on the right side of history. How can Geneseo students get involved in the efforts of the Frederick Douglass family initiatives?
Well, the first thing that you can do is visit our website, FDFI.org. That's the acronym for Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. And our headquarters is located on Main Street. I don't know where you all are with the COVID-19 pandemic, but when things begin to open up again, I hope that each and every one of you will rush down to that office, storm that office, and go to Robert Benz and to Hank Rubin and to Erica Mock and say, I want to help. How can I help? You know, you're right there in Rochester. That our office is going to be open for the community, for events. And if you think about how can you use your passion, your talent, your creativity, and intellect to address issues of racial inequity, racial oppression, and as I said, working together. So go down to that office when it's safe to do so and tell everybody in there. I'm in Southern California, so I'm not there every day, but I plan when the country opens up again, I will be there once a month for a few days or a week, once a month. And so that would be the best way to do it. Go to the website, fdfi.org, and then go down to that office and tell them you want to help.
I put a link to the website in the chat, and Robert Benz has added to the chat that he says, storming is frowned upon right now.
That wasn't probably the best use of words, but it was the imagery and the visual I had of 50 of the students that are on this call, just getting together and saying, let's go down there all at once. So probably not the best use of words.
The idea of storming for social justice, though, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, we can change the narrative of storming and agitators, because that agitator word is taken on a negative connotation these days, whereas Frederick Douglass was an agitator, and he implored us to agitate, speak truth to power, make people feel uncomfortable, push people out of their comfort zones to affect change. And that's exactly what he did his whole career.
I think we maybe have time for one more question. And this is from Anna Salazar. And it's a two-part question, actually. How could these historical racist institutions be dismantled at a federal level? Or do you think a grassroots approach would work best?
A combination of everything. You have to work at the local level, you have to work at the state level and the federal level to change policy, to enact legislation that is anti-racist, and demand that your politicians identify and eliminate policies that are racist. So your vote is very important. But I think it's most important really at the local level to change, to work with those politicians that are anti-racist and want to make sure that these policies are identified and changed, and that there's new legislation that's introduced and enacted.
Thank you very much. I think this has been very illuminating. There are a number of questions still in the chat, and I think we're going to have to continue those conversations on campus throughout the course of this month, and as we continue our journey in becoming an anti-racist college. Ken, I would like to thank you very much for your time, and most importantly, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. It has been incredibly enlightening. I want to thank all the attendees for also joining us, and we hope that you enjoyed listening, and hopefully you were able to take away something that you can apply as we all move forward in this journey towards anti-racism. Don't forget that we have a whole month of events planned, and I hope you will join us for more of these discussions as we continue this journey towards becoming an anti-racist college this month and onward. Thank you very much, Ken. And I hope we get some Geneseo students storming the offices for social justice soon.
I'm going to be checking back to make sure that happens. And Dave, thank you very much for inviting me to share our work with your students and with your audience. We look forward to continuing a partnership with Geneseo. So thank you very much.
That'd be great. I wish you all the best in your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.